All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to start with some introductions for our Workday purchasing training today. I'll start first and then I'll pass it on to Sarah. I am Desi Tillman. I am the business analyst in BCN purchasing. I started at the end of June, so happy to be aboard and learn all the things that we need to know about purchasing and be able to help you learn about any purchasing training. So I'm going to be the moderator today for the presentation, so feel free to put any information in the chat um, and ask any questions, and I'll be able to share the recording with you later. But I'm going to pass it on to Sarah, who will be able to introduce herself and also another presenter that will be joining during the presentation. So Sarah.
Thank you, Desi. For those of you who don't know me, I am Sarah Grosjean. I'm the Assistant Director of Purchasing. I will be starting off our training here today, and I want to thank you for attending. We will have Melanie Lieber, our Director of Purchasing, hop on later throughout the presentation, as well as Mark Young, who is from our Risk Management Office, to speak to some of the insurance requirements. Desi, since you'll be the one moderating the chat, feel free to stop me if somebody does ask a question in chat while I'm going through.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's kick this off. Okay, so for our agenda today, we're going to go over the overall procurement overview, spend categories, use of Workday Tools, our supplier registration system, AssetWorks, what the different procurement options are, when you can use a supplier invoice request, the requisition process, insurance requirements, licenses and certifications, contracts, purchase order process, how to create receipts, and then resources. All right, so first and foremost, the procurement overview. So for those of you that aren't aware, BCN Business Center North services all of the Northern Nevada higher education institutions. So not just UNR, but we also do all of the purchasing for DRI, Great Basin College, TMCC, UNR Lake Tahoe, Western Nevada College, as well as the System Office and System Computing Services. For the procurement overview, we want to talk about the specific things that make up the procurement process. So starting with spend categories, that's what drives, when you're trying to decide what to submit a request under, the different work tags to use, whether or not a supplier is already registered in our supplier registration system or not, and whether that information is up to date. Use of the P card, use of a supplier invoice request, and then finally, requisition and purchase orders. So for spend categories, understanding the importance of spend categories. So they provide operational detail of expense activity that maps to an expense ledger account. So the reason that this is important is that, you want to make sure that you're selecting the most appropriate spend category for what is being provided. So really understanding that it's for what's being purchased, not why or what it pertains to, but what it actually is. So a lot of times, people question, this is for signage installation, but they'll put a labor spend category, that's very generic and that's just labor, but that's not really what it is. It's for signage installation. Or if it's furniture, for instance, and they use an equipment spend category because maybe it's going to be used. A good example would be a lectern that's in a lecture hall that the professor stands at. Well, that's still a piece of furniture. So it's not what it's being used for, but what it is. So it is a required entry on operational transactions that post expenses. So this includes requisitions, invoices, and expense reports. And it also helps us determine whether or not it's a trackable item. So something that is a asset or is a sensitive item. So that's why it's really important to use the correct spend category. So for an example, if you're purchasing a laptop, you would want to use the SC0666 computer laptop spend category, as opposed to the one that is for computer peripherals or computer supplies, because that's for accessories. Additionally, you do not want to choose a goods type requisition and then use a spend category for a type of service or vice versa. So for instance, if you're buying maintenance supplies, you would use a goods spend category instead of using the building maintenance and repair service spend category, because you want to make sure that goods to goods, service to service. Otherwise, we are going to have to send it back to make those changes. There's only a certain number of things that buyers can change without affecting the accounting piece of it, which is why we end up having to send them back for correction. Because as soon as a requisition is initiated in Workday, accounting is tied to it from that very beginning piece. So we aren't going to change anything that's going to mess up the accounting on the backside. And whether, if you're questioning, what is the most appropriate spend category to use, Workday Tools is a very good resource if you're not already familiar with it, to look up different spend categories. You want to just kind of be as generic as possible. So if you were looking for furniture or something repair related, I would just put in furniture or repair, and it'll bring up any spend category that has that word in it. Right now, we do have the ability when you're entering a requisition where Workday will suggest a spend category to you. But because it is AI driven, it's still learning. So it's not always going to present things, even if there are ones that are more suitable. It's going to do the ones that are the most commonly used so far until it starts to get to know more, until it learns more. Although a lot of those suggestions are appropriate, I do suggest using Workday Tools as well. And then you will also know if something's trackable or not. So let me go ahead and just open that up as well, just so you guys can see for those of you that aren't familiar with Workday Tools. So right here under finance objects, it's either on this side or on this side. If you click on spend categories, oh, you can't see it?
No.
Oh, hang on. Let me see where it's at. Okay. Now can you see it?
There you go.
Okay, so let me go back to the main screen. So if you're either under finance objects here or right here on the main landing page, either one's going to take you to the same place, and you click on spend categories. If I were to put in, for instance, let's put in repair. This is going to bring up any spend category that has repair in the title. And this would be, an easy way to look at that. If I was wanting to figure out if something was trackable or not, so like, let's look up laptop. This column right here says is tracked, and yes. So you would know that that is a trackable spend category. For instance, anything that has equipment for the most part that falls under this group of machinery and equipment will have yes next to it that it is tracked, which means that if you use this and the amount is over 5,000 for that particular line, it's going to flag it as an asset. So this is a really good tool. Also, if you're needing to look up work tags, for instance, then this will be covered later on too, but if you're sending over a change order request to one of us and you want to know whose approval we need, you would put in the work tag in here and just copy that person on the request to us, so that way we know it's approved. So right here, it shows the program manager and the program owner for every work tag that's in Workday Tools. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. Okay. And then additionally on our own, and tell me if you can confirm you can see with the screen, back to the presentation.
Yep, you just got to swap your screens again.
Okay. Super fun when I'm looking into it.
That's always fun when you have two.
Okay. Now can you see it?
It should be popping up here in a moment, hopefully. Oh, nope, it's still on the presenter's view.
Okay. Time. Now can you see it?
Oh, that's weird why it's doing that. Yeah, it's still a like presenter view.
Okay, give me a second. Sorry, guys. Technology.
We'll edit in the recording.
Yes. Okay, let me try this one more time. Okay, how's that?
Yay. Okay.
Okay. All right, so on our BCN website, we do have a list of all of the spend categories, and we do update these as there are spend categories that do get added periodically. But we do have a list as well, so that way you know what buyer is assigned to a particular commodity. So that way, if you ever need to check on the status of a requisition you entered, you would be able to see in here who it's likely assigned to. Okay, let me see, I did cover that. Okay, and then also, there are several more generic spend categories that are listed. For instance, there's miscellaneous services, there's other operating supplies, other operating expense. We really want to try to avoid using those as much as possible, unless there really is an instance where there's nothing else that's more applicable. So we do have office supplies, we have maintenance supplies, we have computer supplies, we have printing supplies. There's a number of different spend categories that are out there. So please try to avoid using the miscellaneous ones as much as possible, because we do use these spend categories as well for reporting purposes to see where our spend is. So as accurate as we can be as possible is very helpful. And again, if there is a more appropriate spend category and it's not one that a buyer can change to, we will send those back for correction. Okay. All right, so looking at the suggested spend categories, Workday is going to, when you start putting in an item description here, for instance, if you put in laptop, Workday is going to automatically suggest some spend categories that would be related to that. So all you would need to do when it pops this up is click on it, and it's going to populate that spend category for you. Now, if it didn't pop up the one that is specific to laptop, and you were to put that in this field right here and just put in laptop and hit enter, then it will bring up the spend category that is specific to that. Additionally, if there's others, the spend categories that are coming up don't seem most appropriate, that's the same way. You could either use Workday Tools like I showed you, or you can put it in here, put in a word like repair, and it's going to bring up that same list of any spend categories that have repair in the title. And again, like I said, newer spend categories may not populate until the system starts recognizing that we're using it more frequently. Oops. Workday Tools. So we did go over this. So this is something that you just log in with your net ID. I had already gone over where the manager and the owner are. One thing that I did not discuss yet, and let me go ahead and pull that back up, is the detail codes and ledger accounts. Just 1 minute. Okay, can you see Workday Tools again?
Yes.
Okay. So for the, let me see, the detail codes. So that is under finance objects. And when we're talking about detail codes, a good example of this would be if you're doing something that's with sensitive equipment, hold on a second, this, or grants. So anything that is for capital equipment that's over $5,000 and being paid for in a grant should include this detail code, because that's something that's used for tracking purposes. If there's a grant being used as well, but it's not capitalized equipment, this is the detail code to use for it. There's also detail codes that are related to hosting and travel, that depending on what they are, you would want to look up these as well. So again, this is a very good resource, as well as trying to figure out what ledger account a certain spend category hits. Now, this is where it comes into play that the buyers can only change certain spend categories. So let me show you an example. Would be if I am changing from, hold on a second, from labor, which falls under the 6064 ledger account of other operating expense. If somebody submitted a requisition to us with this spend category that's just generic labor, it's not speaking to anything that they're actually doing, but using my earlier example where it was signage installation. So that is actually on the 6004 purchase services ledger account. We cannot make that change, otherwise it is going to mess up the accounting. So this would be a good example of something we would need to send back in order for the requester to change the spend category, so that way it hits the appropriate ledger and it doesn't create a mismatch. So checking, again, Workday Tools is a great resource to just, if you ever have a question about, why we've sent something back, or you're wanting to know what ledger it hits, this is a good way of looking it up. Let me go back to presentation. Okay, it's not on presenter view, is it?
Oh, it wasn't for a second, then you went back to it.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay. All right. And there is a knowledge base article, which again, you just log in using your NetID, that goes over how to use Workday Tools. And again, we'll have this presentation available for you to reference after the training. Okay. So again, this is what the landing page looks like on Workday Tools. We've talked about the trackable spend categories, whether or not it's tracked. Detail work tags, grant equipment, participant support, travel, and hosting. Again, hosting detail codes and the table purchase spend category cannot be used with state funds. Also, if you were to use a hosting or a travel spend category, you will also get an alert that you need to add the detail code. And that'll happen when you're entering the requisition, is when you'll get the alert. Okay, so for supplier registration, the registration process. So really addressing this before you enter a requisition. We have an SREG administrator in our office, Kenna White, who has canned emails with all of the different instructions that we could go ahead and send, we can provide those to you ahead of time. So you can reach out if it's a new supplier that we've never done business with in order for them to get registered. Now we want to get this done prior, because a lot of times there's back and forth with, in particular, their tax form, their W-9, where it's not completed correctly. So really getting them engaged in that process early on and getting them registered ahead of time is not going to hold up the requisition, because we cannot process a purchase order until a supplier is set up. So there's a couple different phases in terms of the approval. So once they have submitted their correct registration, their W-9, they've uploaded all of that, it's going to go into phase 1 approval, which is approval by Kenna, our internal person. So once she's approved it, that everything is correct, then it's going to go to phase 2, which requires approval by accounts payable. So once it is submitted through phase 2 approval, then they are okay for us to process a purchase order to, and it will actually say approved as their supplier status when you go to SREG. If you're in SREG and you're trying to look them up and it has that their status is in supplier update, that's because something was wrong with the registration application that they submitted and they're needing to update it. And if there was something wrong with it, whoever the administrator was, because we do have some people in the South that also facilitate the approval process in SREG, they would notify whoever the contact was on that registration about what needed to be updated. But you can always check that at the SREG website yourself. It'll show you what the status is. If it's anything other than approved, there's something wrong with their registration. And you could reach out to us for guidance on what needs to be done. There's also a SREG Lite that is available solely for guest speakers, participant support, and student payments. Everything else should go through the main SREG website, which is niche-wide. But additionally, before just having somebody create one, just go to SREG and just make sure that they're already in approved status before you submit a requisition if you're not sure. Okay, so again, we have help documentation that Kenna can provide. Again, those canned emails that have detailed instructions with screenshots, we can certainly provide that to you so you have it on hand for any new suppliers you may work with. Once a supplier is registered, they can go into their SREG account and modify their information at any time. We cannot make any changes to financial information. That needs to be done by their supplier admin. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, Desi. but that mainly because that needs to be all verifiable on the back end. We don't want to be touching any of the financial information. I do see some chats too.
Yep, there's a
Okay.
couple. Who notifies vendors when their info needs to be updated? Old vendor.
So in terms of whether or not it's old from the last time we did business with them to now, that would really only come up if, for instance, let's say that somebody has like the supplier admin that's linked to their account is no longer with the company. Generally, the buyer finds that out by either the department is saying that the supplier reached out to them and they didn't receive a copy of the PO. And so we go back and we look to see who the PO was emailed to. And then at that point, they confirm to us that that person's no longer there. Or if we need to reach out for insurance and we get a bounce back, that's really the only time we know that it hasn't been updated. But when we do encounter those issues, we ask Kenna to work with the supplier directly on updating their account. So, and there can be multiple supplier users. We do recommend that for suppliers. So that way, if that ever does happen, then there's at least more than one person that can modify their SREG account. But they do audit. So if it's been a long time since we've worked with a vendor and their W-9 form is too old for us to currently accept, that's been happening quite a bit, where somebody will go in to update their account and they'll update the supplier admin or whoever needs to receive POs. And that'll anytime they make a change like that, it's going to automatically put them back into the approval process. So that way Kenna or one of the other admins can review it. And if they see at that point that their W-9, for instance, is on an old form, then they're going to reach out to them at that point that says we need an updated W-9. So that's another way that we're pinged that something's out of date. And then Risha's question, okay, in terms of insurance. Well, we will go over insurance later, but basically, the insurance is only good for the term that is listed on their insurance certificate. So if they provide it to us today, but it expires in a week, it's only good until it expires. So it's up to them. And especially if their work is going to be done, it carries over that period, then they need to provide us their renewal certificate. So that way we show that they have current coverage on file for the entire duration of time that they're providing us service. All right, let me see. Okay, so another big note about an approved SREG account. Because this system is used niche-wide and it includes both suppliers that provide just goods as well as ones that provide services, none of the insurance or licensing requirements are a part of the approval process for an SREG account. So just because a supplier is approved in SREG, all that means is that they are okay to pay once we have an invoice. That is all that means. That does not mean that we have current insurance on file. That does not mean that we have current licenses on file, because that is not a requirement of every single vendor, because not every single vendor provides services that would require licenses or insurance. So I just want to be very clear on that all an approved SREG account means is we can pay them. That is it. So in terms of support for SREG, if it's supplier invoice related, you would want to contact AP. If it's purchase order related, Kenna. And then let me see. So it looks like, Desi, am I correct that this checklist is the one that Kenna provides regarding the registration process, or is that the knowledge base article?
Yeah, that's the one that she gives to the
Okay.
individuals on the registration process. Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right. Let's see. Now, in terms of AssetWorks, I'm just going to go over a brief overview on this because our assets department goes over their own full training. So if you do want more in-depth information related to this, we do have information here for that. So assets is a unit within purchasing, and they have the responsibility of tagging, reporting, and controlling of all capital equipment in BCN institutions. So the way that they manage that is through the AssetWorks system. And that is a fixed asset system that houses all of our fixed asset data. So it stores this information and it calculates and reflects the accumulated depreciation expense for the relevant categories of fixed assets. So if you would like more information and have more in-depth training for this, we do have a link to their training calendar. And this training would be good for anybody who initiates requisitions for equipment or sensitive assets that need to be tracked. So they cover everything from asset registration within AssetWorks to surplus requests and transfers, and then as well as transfers between positions and locations. So for instance, an asset, was registered to one person, but that person's gone now, how you're able to move it to somebody else. They also cover reporting on the assets that somebody is responsible for, the person that is associated with that asset, what they need to report on. So again, any questions related to that can be directed directly to our assets team. All right, now let's get into the fun stuff of procurement options. So we have this nice little workflow that kind of goes over exactly when like P card and purchase order should be used. So for instance, P card, anything under 5,000 is the preferred method unless it's going to be an ongoing purchase. The only exception, let's see, hold on a moment, would be utilities. We want to have, let's see, ongoing purchasing except utilities. Yes, and then same with services. No services or deposits should ever be made on a P card. Those need to go on a purchase order. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we need to check for insurance, other things, because that's not driven by an amount. That's really if anybody is providing services on a niche owned property physically coming on, that we need to check for those things. For amounts of 5,000 to 24,999, that would be done by purchase order with one quote or an approved competitive exception, or if there's an existing contract. And an existing contract can be a state contract, if we have a cooperative contract with one of the consortiums that we work with, or if there's like a previously bid contract, then that could be used. Now for purchases that are over 25,000 to 49,999, this is for goods and services that are not professional in nature, and I will go over that again later. Non-professional would mean things that are not a consultant, not an accountant, not an auditor, not a training provider. All of those, and just let's see, would be 2 quotes that are required, an approved competitive exception or an existing contract, and those need to be done on a purchase order as well. For 25,000 to 74,999, and that is for professional services that are not construction related. Again, same thing, 2 quotes or an approved competitive exception, an existing contract. Construction related procurement has its own thresholds. So for anything construction related, and when I say construction related, that is a very broad term. That would be anything that requires a contractor's license, which again, I will go over further in the licensing section in here. But that doesn't necessarily mean actual construction or renovation. That could be painting, that could be flooring, that could be signage. There's some furniture installation that requires a contractor's license that would fall under. And then A&E is architects and engineers. They follow the same thresholds. And with anything that requires a contractor's license, the NRS requires that 3 competitive quotes be solicited. We cannot approve a competitive exception for anything that is construction related unless it's qualifiable under the NRS statute for an emergency. So, but just to be clear, especially because you guys have rural areas, if you have solicited a quote from multiple vendors and let's say one of them got back to you, one never responded and one declined, maybe because of the location or they're not able to fit it into their schedule. All 3 of those things satisfy the requirement for soliciting those quotes. We just need documentation to that effect because that's showing our compliance with the statute. So if you're not able to actually get 3 hard bids, we're not going to say that you can't move forward with it, but you need to have attempted to solicit the required 3 and have the appropriate documentation backing it up if you weren't able to get 3 hard quotes. Now for anything that is over 49,999 or over 74,999, and that's for not construction related, those would need to be formally bid. Anything that is over 99,999 that is construction related and architects, engineers needs to be formally bid. And I will go into that a bit more. Okay, so here's where we outline all of that. So again, purchases under $5,000 without a P card. When a vendor does not accept P card or the department doesn't have one, then this is when you would want to use a requisition or a supplier invoice request. And we do have the acceptable uses of the supplier invoice request, which I will also go over later on. For the same thing for the purchases that I discussed between $5,000 to $24,999, that's when one quote is required or an approved competitive exception. Now, it is always encouraged to try to get, an additional quote beyond the one that's just required, because again, just a good use of money and also demonstrating that we're trying to get competition from other people, as opposed to just going with our kind of tried and true ones that we always default to. 25,000 to 49,999. Again, this is for goods and services that are not construction related and not professional in nature, like a consultant. 2 quotes or an approved competitive exception are required. And if you ever feel like you are going to try to submit a competitive exception, I do recommend submitting that to our department ahead of time for review. So that way we can let you know if there's any additional information you need without holding up the requisition process. For purchases between 25,000 to 74,999, this is for professional services that are not construction related. Again, 2 quotes required or approved competitive exception. Now getting into the construction related and architect engineering again, 3 comparable quotes. Now the difference is with architects and engineers, we are statutorily prohibited from awarding those based on cost. So we do actually have a consultant evaluation form because they are to be awarded based on their qualifications, their ability to actually perform the work. The consultant evaluation form basically serves as that justification that we at least did solicit 3 firms and why we chose the one that we did. Competitive exceptions, again, do not apply to construction unless it's an emergency that's defined in 33811, which I will go over. Again, if you have a unique situation, that would be something that I would reach out to us for assistance as early as possible. The sooner we get involved, the better it is, so that way we can guide you going forward. We really want to be a resource for you and support, because we do have to comply with all these rules and regulations. So as early on as we can be involved to deal with all of those things, the quicker we can get a request processed. All right, so in terms of formal solicitation options, we have a couple different types of formal solicitations that we do. Those are RFP, ITB, and RFQ. An RFP is a request for proposal, and that generally includes pricing. So it is the most used type of formal solicitation. We do it a lot for services and for goods as well. In particular, if we're trying to evaluate things other than cost as well. So let me take a look here. So for instance, where cost is a factor, but it's not the determining factor. So a good example would be if we were purchasing some sort of specialized type of equipment, we would want to ensure that they're meeting the specs, of what our needs truly are for that. But also, like we're taking price into account, but we might care more about the fact that it's meeting certain requirements or warranty concerns than we are with the price. So that's where an RFP comes into play. And these thresholds for over 75,000, would apply to professional services, like I said, consultants, accountants, auditors, appraisers, software designer, training provider. Those are just some examples of professional services that are not construction related. And ITB is another, and this is invitation to bid, another form of solicitation. We use this primarily, I would say, for just straight goods A good example would be, we did one for heating filters. We did one for light bulbs. One where they're not very technical like equipment would be. And then we also we're required to bid anything construction related as an ITV. And this type of solicitation is awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. So what that means is whoever has the lowest bid, if they have all of the appropriate licenses and they're current and in good standing, that's what makes them a responsive and responsible bidder. The 49,999 threshold applies to goods and services that are not professional, but we do invitations to bid for anything that is estimated to be close to the $100,000 mark for anything construction related. So we bid this out for flooring, for painting, minor renovations. Trying to think of other good examples here. Heating, plumbing work, roofing, again, signage. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff that's construction related that gets bid out this way. And then the request for qualifications, the RFQ, this is typically only used for A&E projects, so architects and engineers, because we are not permitted to award it based on price. So that's why with these types of formal solicitations, they can only be awarded based on qualifications. And once an intent to award is issued, that's when they start negotiating their fee. So in terms of the formal solicitation process as a whole, there are instances where exceptions could be granted when a formal solicitation is not the most practical. So in these cases, a competitive exception sole source request, could be evaluated. And this would be something that would need to be submitted to our office to review and approve. So always reaching out to us ahead of time if you have what you consider a unique situation and you want us to weigh in. All right, so going into further the supplier invoice request and when it can be used. So if the supplier does not accept credit cards and so you cannot use a P card, and there's not going to be any, and no tangible goods or services are received, then you can use the supplier invoice request. So examples are utility payments, certifications, memberships, permits, fees. This is when you can use it. And this is a link to the authorized uses. So these are all of the items that it should not be used for. So you should not be using a supplier invoice request for transactions that are over 5,000, transactions in which the P card can be used, software maintenance agreements, ongoing purchases. So anything that you're being billed for, like monthly, weekly, all of those should be entered in on for instance, a blanket purchase order. Transactions that have an associated contract should never be done on a supplier invoice request. If you're reimbursing an employee or student, if you're paying a guest speaker or an independent contractor, those should be submitted on the appropriate requisition type. And if you're purchasing goods or services, again, that should all be done on a requisition and not be using the supplier invoice request. And AP has been doing a pretty good job of flagging any supplier invoice requests that they get that they believe should have been done on a purchase order. And in some instances, those will be denied and you'll be instructed to enter a requisition. All right, so as a quick reference, these are the procedures to follow when procuring goods and services. Create the requisition in Workday, wait to receive notification that the PO has been approved, which you would get that notification in your email that the PO has been issued to the supplier in our automatic overnight issue process. Once the goods and services are provided and complete, you would create the receipt in Workday and email or mail in the invoice to AP in order for payment to be processed. And again, we do have a link to the checklist for purchasing goods or services in the knowledge base for your reference. Requisitions. Okay, so there are 4 different types of requisition types in Workday. One is goods or services, and this is generally for a one-time purchase or a one-time, project service that's being provided. Open-ended and blanket PO, which is for anything that is ongoing. So if you're going to be paying something monthly, then this would be the type that you would want to use. And then guest speaker and independent contractor. Now, the main thing for you to understand as well is that the goods, services, open-ended blanket PO requisition types route through one workflow process, and the guest speaker and independent contractors route through another process. So if you submit an independent contractor under a goods, services requisition type, we're not going to be able to send those back and have you correct it. We're going to actually have to cancel that and have it be completely re-entered as a independent contractor requisition type. Because once it's initiated as one, Workday goes through that entire workflow process and we can't change that. So it is very critical that you select the appropriate one, the correct one. And if you're not sure, reach out to us, because it's going to have to go through, it goes through that whole approval process. And if by the time we have caught that and we have to cancel it, you're going to have to do it all over again. So this just saves time by ensuring that you're selecting the correct requisition type. So again, the requisition type determines how you can receive. So goods are for tangible items that will be delivered to you and will be received by quantity. Services are intangible and will be received by dollars. Now, for any open-ended or blanket PO request, those need to be entered on a services line regardless of what's being purchased. So even if you're putting in a blanket purchase order for the year and you're going to be purchasing janitorial supplies, even though those are goods, they need to be entered on a service line because it's going to be by dollars, because you're not sure how much you're going to be purchasing. So you can't put in a quantity, otherwise it'll restrict you to just that amount and it would need to be on a goods line. So across the board, blanket POs need to be on a service line. So in terms of what you should make sure that you have before you submit a requisition, checking to make sure that you have chosen the most appropriate spend category for what is actually being provided, that you put in an accurate item description, that the supplier is populated and that it is the correct one, and or that you have already initiated that process to get them registered in SREG, that your quantity and cost is correct, that the start and end date is correct, matches what may be on a quote or a contract, and that the extended amount, if you end up having multiple lines, matches what your total should be, especially if you have an associated proposal or contract that matches that amount. That you have the correct work tags as well as any detail codes that need to be added. And then another critical thing would be the attachments, that you have a current quote. If a quote notes that it's only good for 30 days and it's past that point, if you get an email from the supplier that they will still honor that and or have them update that, otherwise it could get kicked back by the buyer because we can't use an expired quote. For blanket purchase orders, if let's say that it's for services and you're not really sure what they're going to be charged, let's say it's for after hours repairs, then in those instances we would want like a rate sheet, something that shows what they're charging hourly, so that way we have some sort of backup as to what they're going to be charging us. If there's an associated contract and or if they've already provided insurance to you, uploading all of those attachments separately to the requisition for us really helps us out to double check that stuff later on. For independent contractors, you're going to want to ensure that the independent contractor agreement and risk management approval of the insurance is already uploaded to the requisition before it comes to us. Otherwise, we're going to have to send it back until it is. And then additionally, whenever a deposit is required, AP requires that an invoice for just the deposit is attached and included. They will not pay off of a quote that just notes a deposit. So you need to always ensure that that invoice is provided. Otherwise, we're going to have to reach out to you for that before we can process the requisition. And we do have a number of links here to knowledge base articles that are specific to how to create a requisition for goods, how to create one for services, how to create BPOs, the IC and guest speakers category, as well as processing supplier deposits, because that is also its own process. All right. Now, these are some things to keep in mind. So when you've submitted a requisition, like I just said before, you want to make sure that you've attached whatever we need to know is uploaded to the requisition. Quotes, proposals, competitive exceptions, contract, signed hosting form. If you're purchasing anything that has a logo on it, that you have the print release approval. And we do request that you attach them as separate documents because we don't forward anything that's internal to the supplier. So we would only want to send them the quote. Equipment orders that need to be tagged as inventory or sensitive equipment have to be ordered by quantity, and they cannot be split by the amount. So you won't want to use lot as the unit of measure for equipment. It needs to be each. Anything that if you do need to split the cost, it cannot be done on the purchase order. That will have to be done by a journal voucher after it's already receipted. That's the only way we can do that when it comes to inventory, unfortunately. For software purchases, those need to follow the accessibility guidelines, and we have put a link to the accessibility policy. I want you to note as well that anytime you use a software spend category, those requisitions are going to automatically route to IT and Workday for approval on the accessibility before they even come to us. Use of the internal and supplier memo boxes. This is very helpful when there is, let's say, if the supplier requires a signed quote. We don't always sign the quotes because we're not trying to waste paper if necessary, because once we process the PO, that's basically our acknowledgement that we're accepting the quote. Additionally, if there is a deposit required, that needs to be noted in the internal memo field. So that way the buyer knows that the work tag manager acknowledges that there is a deposit required and is okay with paying that. We do try to avoid paying deposits whenever necessary, and in particular with suppliers we've never worked with before. And if you ever feel like you need help negotiating any of that, we will. Let's see, I see Risha's notes. Okay, thank you. All right, let's see what else. Slide. Okay, so Costco and Home Depot do not accept purchase orders, so please do not enter those. These would be purchases that you would likely need to do on a P card if needed. Again, we do not like splits. They are very difficult for you guys as well as for us. So what we recommend is that if something needs to be paid by more than one account, we ask that you enter separate lines for each account. Workday is really difficult. If we ever need to go back in and process a change order, it's just really, really hard for us to change split lines. So as much as possible, avoid using those. You also cannot enter more than one supplier on a requisition. It should just be one supplier per requisition. Anything that has freight or installation charges, unless it's an asset, do not use the freight and other charges fields that are in the header. Again, these do not play well when we have to do a change order later on. So the only times you're going to use those freight or other charges fields is specific to an asset. Any other time, if we're being charged freight, that needs to be entered on a separate service line. And we've listed, for instance, the inbound freight spend category here for your reference. If there are setup or installation or labor charges, those would get entered on a service line using the labor installation. So again, if it is for assets only, that is the only time you're going to use those fields. And that way it can be allocated to the asset. Now let me see. And then again, if you only want the freight to be charged to one account, indicate so in the memo field and add a line for freight so it's charged to the appropriate account. All right, so for emergency purchases. Emergency purchases of goods or services can be approved, and this is the NRS that it's pursuant to, when there is a current threat to the health, safety, or welfare of the public. So a good example would be that I had come up recently was when there's a flood. The emergency aspect of the flood is the remediation and the cleanup of like the immediate service that's addressed to clean that up. It cannot be qualified as an emergency once that remediation effort has been completed. And then now we have to like replace the flooring or replace the drywall. That does not meet the statute of an emergency because we have already dealt with the current threat. Everything else after that point would need to follow the regular thresholds and the regular purchasing process. Now, if there is a true emergency request, please submit that information, whatever information you have related to the emergency, to myself, Mel, and Fred. So that way we can verify that we have insurance and that the contractor has current licenses as well. And if not, we'll start reaching out to them, but we will still approve an emergency if it truly does meet that current threat issue. And we will give that by email, even if you don't have a quote, for the goods or services yet. But once you do receive that, and once a requisition is submitted in Workday, a copy of our email approval, along with the final quote or invoice, should be attached as backup to that requisition, because sometimes we don't even get those invoices till, weeks later after an emergency has happened. So that's a reminder to us that we've already previously approved it. Okay, and then facilities review of quotes that are related to architects, engineers, or construction. So for instance, when a requisition comes to purchasing for review, because we are the final review, final approval in the requisition routing in Workday, we will review the quotes. And if we see something that is related to architect engineering services or construction related, and it's services that are going to be on niche owned or leased property, we will reach out to facilities to determine whether or not that request needs to be routed through them, because they have things where they need to create it as a project, or it needs to route through their team to ensure that it's meeting our design and construction standards. So we will send a copy of the quote to facilities for review. If they determine that it is work that needs to route through their office, the requisition will be canceled and it'll need to be submitted through their regular request process. And then their office will initiate a requisition for that work. There is this useful requisitions app within Workday. So once you have submitted requisitions, and you click on this little tile that says requisitions, this will show you where anything that you've entered is at in its process. So this is a list of completed, for instance, and it'll show if they're approved, closed. It'll show if it's still in process, routing for approval. Sorry, I thought there was one more slide, but this is a good place for you to check on the status of anything, and you can edit how you want to filter it. Very useful for tracking where something is. Now, I do see that Mark Young has jumped on from risk management. So I'm going to go ahead and have Mark introduce himself. And Mark, I don't know if you wanted me to go over this slide or if you feel comfortable doing so and you just want to pitch in where needed.
Whatever, I can just go over kind of, if you hear that I missed something, feel free to jump in. And I'm just going to kind of take a higher view on things, but maybe we'll dive a little bit in some of the stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
okay, I'll
Mark
go
Young.
ahead. Go ahead. You go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll go into the slide.
So my name is Mark Young. I work at BCN Risk Management, located on the UNR campus, and we oversee insurance and risk management over the BCN campuses. And yeah, so I am. Kind of the things I look over is contracts, claims, insurance policy renewals, international transportation for certain campuses, among every other question when it comes to risk and policies on campus. So kind of very widespread. I love it. So that's about it for me as far as background.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so I do have a link to the BCN Risk Management's website for insurance requirements. So that way you have it here. And that has the different types of insurance as well as the coverage limits that we require, the minimum coverage limits. So insurance is required for any service that is provided on niche-owned or leased property, and it needs to be current and on file with purchasing prior to work commencing. This is critical because if, let's say, for example, we have a vendor that comes on site and they like hit a student and we don't have insurance on file for them, that could create a liability issue that risk management will end up having to work with. Any remotely provided services may still require insurance depending on the service that's being provided. So if they're not going to set foot on a niche-owned or leased campus, then they don't need to provide our general liability, business auto, and workers' comp because they're never going to be on site. However, if they're providing any legal or consulting services or accounting services, then that may require professional liability service because if something, were to go wrong in those instances, we need to have that insurance on file, again, from, to protect us from a liability standpoint. The standard minimum insurance requirements that we require of any vendor that's coming onto campus, coming onto niche-owned property, I should say, or leased property, is general liability, business auto liability, and workers' compensation. There are caveats to all of those. So for instance, if you're working with somebody who doesn't have any employees and they're the only ones working, then they wouldn't have any workers' comp, but they would need to sign an affidavit that they're rejecting that. That is basically on file forever unless it changes where they do start hiring employees. We often get from smaller companies that don't have business auto that has like the $1 million limits. They may have lower limits. We still request a copy of those insurance certificates, even if it is personal coverage, and the buyer will submit that to risk management for review. They take into account, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, they take into account, the total amount of work they're going to be doing, and whether if that makes sense under what their personal coverage may show. Let's see. So again, professional services, like legal, like a consultant, would require professional liability in addition to the general liability, auto, and workers' comp if they're coming onto niche-owned property. Software, financial program services require technology errors and omissions or cyber liability. And then additionally, certain services may require additional or special insurance that we would consult with risk management on. So something that comes up pretty frequently would be if somebody is going to be doing work that requires the use of a lift. Like if they're doing signage repair or roofing, there is a special type of insurance that covers the use of a lift if it's one that they're bringing on site. Something else that has come up in the past is if we're purchasing a large piece of equipment, something that is going to be transported to our property, insurance that's required to cover that equipment in transport in the event they were to get into an accident or damage it, it was damaged en route. I'm trying to think of other instances.
Rigorous insurance?
Yeah.
So rigorous insurance would be if you're lifting, say, an HVAC system on top of a roof, a very expensive piece of equipment. So when that equipment is on actual crane hook, when it literally gets lifted off the ground, it's covered for insurance for the property itself that's being lifted, also any injury, bodily injury and property damage, failure of that falling.
Can you speak up just a little bit, Mark? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. How about now? Is that better?
Yes.
So as far as the rigorous insurance, it insures the property on the hook, and it also ensures that if anything happens to that equipment, it falls and it breaks and it lands on something that ruins somebody else's property, it's covering that or bodily injury to somebody on the ground in that situation. That's really important.
And one that I didn't note on here that also comes up quite frequently would be pollution liability. So pollution liability would be required of any work, for instance, that requires digging, trenching. There could be certain types of flooring because of the glue, I believe, right, that's used,
Yep.
Mark?
Yep. Yeah, so this coverage really essentially your commercial general liability policy is going to have exclusions related to anything environmental. So whether a person has an illness because of fumes in a building or somebody's doing dirt work outside and a rainstorm comes and they're not finished with their work. Water was a nearby apartment building. I cover those types of situations. The list goes on and on as far as what those types of situations can be. But I would say most contractors, construction contractors, would definitely want a policy to cover those coverages that are not covered in CPO.
I don't think I heard that last part.
Oh, most contractors would. I don't know why my mic's not working very well. Sorry about that.
No worries.
The mic or the contractors want to make sure that they have a pollution liability to cover things that are excluded on their CPO.
Yes, and anything that requires, like, for instance, like hazardous waste removal would require pollution liability, painting, roofing work, all of those things. And again, most of the time, those contractors already have that on their policy. But just so you're aware of the different types of things. And then NICHI always needs to be listed as additionally insured with endorsement forms. And I call that out specifically because we do get a lot of pushback on this from contractors where they send us what is called the Accord form, which shows all their different policies, the term limits, and the amounts. And then there's a little checkbox that says like additional insured and it's checked. That is not sufficient. We need the actual endorsements that show us as additionally insured. And we provide that to risk to ensure that it is the correct endorsement, as well as a waiver of subrogation against NICHI on all liability insurance and workers' comp policies.
Let me add a little bit there. So the reason why that endorsement page is so important is, and I'm not going to get into the weeds about, there's lots of different endorsements and we require a few, but essentially what that does is it changes the actual policy. So if somebody puts a checkbox on the certificate of the Accord, and has some language down in the text box below and says that they're additionally insuring NG, UNR, for example, per the agreement, right? That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't give us any coverage. That endorsement is what changes the policy. And that's why we look for that as confirmation that the policy is actually changed. And what the additional insured essentially does is provide us as just as this equal part to that policy as the person who purchased the policy. It allows us to file a claim if we're sued. It allows us to file a claim on that policy, whether the contractor who owns that policy agrees with us or not. So it's very, very important. And then the waiver of subrogation, what that does is it waives their right to have their insurance company file a claim on our insurance. So essentially, per contract says, no, you can't tell your insurance company to go after us. That's what happens in many cases. That's what insurance companies want to do. You get into a car accident, you don't want to deal with the other person's car insurance. You file a claim with your insurance, and then your insurance goes after their insurance. This negates that when it comes to whatever type of claim you have going on.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for clarifying that. And as always, because this is very confusing and we don't expect all of you guys to be insurance experts, if, at any time you're confused about what may be required, feel free to ask the contractor. You can ask us directly what may be required for it ahead of time, so that way you can address it right up front. And or what we try to do is we try to get in touch with the contractor's insurance carrier directly, mainly because they oftentimes don't know what we're asking for, and we can't make any changes to their policy. Just because we're talking to their carrier doesn't mean we're going to add anything, or end up costing them more money. Really, if they don't have that coverage, that's just something that we can communicate to their carrier that we require, and then they can talk to their client about that. That tends to help, bridge the gap and make things a lot more efficient if we're able to communicate with them directly. And we usually have the contractor on copy, so they're aware of whatever we're asking for, but it just helps talking to someone who understands what our requirements are. Do you have anything else to add, Mark?
No, I think you covered it very well, actually. And I would like to just show a few pictures, if you guys don't mind, to kind of bring it all I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully.
Oh, and there is a chat from Risha as well,
Oh.
before you do that, Mark.
Yeah.
So let's see.
Go
So
for it.
she's asking specific to ICs and guest speakers and the insurance waiver reasoning for that.
Yeah. So guest speakers, NSHE or BCN and NSHE have pretty much said, unless it's a high risk, BCN risk management doesn't need to review the insurance for a guest speaker. For ICAs, you know, that is something that we look on. I mean, I get 10 to 20 a day, or at least our office does. And so we're looking for the outliers in those situations. It's not as critical when it comes to, like, say, larger contracts or stuff like that. POs going out. But we're looking for situations. I had an example. I waive 95%, Risha, to give you an example, 95% by waive insurance ICAs. Because what we're doing, let me kind of go backwards a little bit. What Sarah's talking about here on this slide is risk transfer. We're transferring the risk, and one way to do that is through insurance policies. We're transferring the risk from NSHE and UNR, or whoever the BCN campus is, from our insurance policies to somebody else's insurance policies. In other words, we don't want to have that risk, so we're transferring the risk from their insurance. Same with ICAs. When we waive those, we're saying, well, it's an acceptable risk that we're willing to take on that with our own insurance policies. Because remember, we're self-insured. We have excess policies above that beyond to cover us if something goes wrong. So when I waive insurance, I'm just waiving their insurance. I'm not waiving that we don't have our own policies to cover should something happen. So a lot of those ICAs are lower risk situations. And so we as a BCN mitigate that by kind of understanding what's going out, what campuses are doing. That's why we want to see what's going on. But we're mitigating it, and then we're allowing us to take on that risk ourselves. A good example of what happens that you may not be aware of is somebody hires a food vendor and they don't have insurance. And so that's a big one that I catch quite often. And that's, you know, something that obviously we'd want to have them have and go through that whole thing. So that maybe, does that help answer your question? Should probably put the chat up so I can. Okay, cool. So yeah, it's really, you know, I'm training. Yeah, I'm training Taylor on that as well. And, you know, sometimes I get this a little off where, you know, maybe one day my risk tolerance is a little more than the next week. And so I have been known to kind of been not, maybe has been not consistent, but for the most part, I try to be very consistent in that thinking. The one thing we can't really waive, obviously, without obviously following NRS is
Is what? Could you say that one more time, Mark?
Sorry, with workers' comp and affidavits, we have to make sure we can't only with the certain answers to questions that allow us to do that. With affidavits as required. So.
Okay, and then if you wanted to, if there were slides that or documents that you wanted to share, you should have the ability to share.
Cool. So see, can you guys see that picture of the FedEx truck?
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, I think people kind of get complacent whether insurance. The reason why I show these is because claims happen all the time. We're dealing with them. I have 26 claims active right now. And the insurance is really, really important. We use it. We have to file claims, and sometimes they're small claims and sometimes there's big claims. This is where a FedEx, we didn't have a contract with FedEx, obviously, but we still filed a claim against their insurance because they're a carrier. They got their wheel off onto the grass, and you can't tell how steep this is, but they were, every time they tried to get off the grass moving, they slid farther down towards the bushes, which is on the other side of the bushes. It's a lake, Manzanita Lake. And so even though this claim was only about $2,600 with landscaping damage, it could have been a lot worse where we had a tractor trailer into the lake and further damage with poles, etc. So just one example. Another example is signage. This was where a truck was coming in and was a crane actually for one of the construction projects for a Pennington engineering building. And they took out the sign. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but that sign cost $6,400. So we file a claim with the contractor's insurance and get that money back. Another one is, this was a catering truck up on UNR campus. This is exactly why we say, hey, if you're driving a vehicle up, I'm pretty, on the ICAs, I'm pretty lenient when it comes to a truck or car just in the parking lot. But when they start getting up on the services that are not made for vehicles, this is where we get very hypercritical of it. And this is exactly why. You know, the drivers didn't really understand what was going on as far as the overhang, hit it, and honor court. And this was a $50,000 claim that lasted over a year. And, you know, was it an accident? Of course, but we had to file a claim against the catering services vehicle for a auto liability policy. So just yet another example of why we ask this question. Business auto. And just to clarify, reason why we have business auto, it covers, you know, liability for bodily injury and property where a vehicle is involved, where a CGL is will have an exclusion for that. It's not going to handle a vehicle. And then also a reason why sometimes we don't accept personal auto liability insurance is because a lot of personal liability insurance policies don't have exclusions that they won't cover business losses.
Mark, there is a request if you could speak up just a little louder from the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, so anyway, this is just an example of the business auto liability policy that claimed that we had to file a claim against the catering service, and you know, real loss, $50,000. This is the last one, is just a quick picture of, even though it's small, it's a lens on a vehicle. This was actually 3 weeks ago, and it was Chief James's UNR PD Chief James's vehicle was hit actually. So it's a bad person to hit as far as that goes. But it was $870 lens cap. And so even if it's a small claim, you know, we don't want UNR PD to lose $860 that they could put to wellness for their employees. So we filed a claim and we'll get that. That was another contractor on our campus that accidentally hit it. It was an accident, but they had insurance and we filed a claim. So just wanted to give some examples of, you know, it's super important. Claims happen all the time, and we want to make sure we're protecting the interests of the campuses so they can go out the mission.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those examples, Mark. I feel like that helps quite a bit. And I want to open this up because Mark's not going to stay on for the entire presentation for any specific insurance questions that you may have before he hops off.
And let's see.
And feel free to unmute or ask in the chat if you have any specific questions.
Okay, we're good or no? Maybe?
It looks like I think we're good. So if you do think of any questions that you may have later specific to insurance, feel free to reach out to us or Risk. But thank you, Mark. I really do appreciate your time for that and sharing those examples. I feel like, you know, adding some visual
yes
to the type of stuff that you're dealing with, you know, really kind of helps, you know, people understand, you know, that this is a requirement that we have to, you know, abide by, and that it really is protecting us, you know, as well as the public.
Yeah, it's well worth the time and energy beforehand to make sure that we have insurance in place before any work gets done. Because the last thing that we want to have to do is not have that coverage and come back to campus and say, sorry, you don't have any money for this coming from insurance, and it's devastating. So make sure we do it. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mark. All right, Desi, can you confirm that you can still see my screen?
I can see your screen, but it's just on the presenter view.
It is still. Okay. I'm gonna get it right one of these times. Well, let me try this one. Is this correct?
Here we go.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. So now on to licenses and certifications. Okay, so now that I see that Mel is on, I'm gonna see if she wants to go ahead and take this one on in particular, and then I can cover the rest of the licenses. And Mel, if you wanted to introduce yourself, I did kind of a brief introduction initially.
Sure, thank you very much. And everyone, I appreciate you being on this training today. I'm Melanie Lever. I'm the Director of BCN Purchasing, and we're here to help you and appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with us. Sorry that I had to join a little bit late. I had a conflicting meeting. But State of Nevada business license, this is one of, I think, the hardest NRSs and policies that we are responsible for compliance with, because suppliers that do not reside in Nevada but will be performing work in Nevada are required to be compliant, and they're hesitant to do that. So to understand a little bit more, this is not, we have a policy regarding the requirement of a state business license, but it's to be compliant with Nevada revised statutes. And so it is a law we have to follow, and no one at UNR or BCN or NCHI for that matter can waive the business license requirement. The only entity that can waive that is the Secretary of State's office. So our responsibility in this is to ensure that for any purchase over $25,000 that we have validated that the supplier has a current state of Nevada business license and is in good standing. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have to have a license if the procurement is under $25,000, but it means that at $25,000, we have to have the actual license number. And then for any other purchase, the supplier is required to be compliant by accepting our purchase order. So our purchase order terms and conditions specifically require that they represent and warrant that they hold a Nevada business license, or that they're not required to obtain one. And that's pursuant to NRS. So again, if it's a not-for-profit entity, they aren't required to have a Nevada business license. But if it's anything else and they're performing the work in the state of Nevada, it is required. And if anyone has any questions about this piece, please don't hesitate to unmute or ask in chat. I know that this one can be hard to get suppliers to work with us on. And we're always willing to help you navigate that communication with the supplier whenever needed.
Thank you, Mel.
Yeah, no problem.
So going on to state of Nevada contractors licenses. So a current, and sorry that I'm working remotely in case you can hear the dogs in the background, I apologize. A current and valid state of Nevada contractor's license is required for any construction related work, regardless of the dollar amount of the quoted work. So this includes flooring, painting, electrical, plumbing, heating and ventilation, AC, furniture installation, signage, landscaping, fencing, fire protection, etc. All of these require a contractor's license, and it is required for any work, regardless of the dollar amount or the extent of the scope of work. And it needs to be I apologize. A current and valid contractor's license needs to be on file with our office prior to work commencing. And I do have the links if you need to check that for yourself. If you want to verify if a particular contractor has a current license, this would be the link that this is where we double check it, as well as a list of the different types of contractors license classifications and what they cover. So I do have those links there. Additionally, what goes along with this is a state public works division bidder qualification. Any work that requires a contractor's license that's going to be done on a public work, and a public work is any work that is being paid for with public funds, must be a qualified bidder through state public works. That does not matter the amount. And technically the way that the statute is that they have to be a qualified bidder before we can even solicit a quote from them. So this goes hand in hand with the contractor's licenses. And I do have a link to the public list of qualified bidders on State Public Works. It's not always updated so as frequently as it should. So I do often reach out to our contact there to determine if, like, for instance, if there was somebody that was submitting a new application, trying to keep track of where they are at in the review and approval process. Again, this needs to be on file with us prior to work commencing. Then I've also included a link to the State of Nevada Labor Commissioner's disqualified contractors list as well. State Public Works doesn't maintain that, but the Labor Commissioner does maintain their own disqualified contractors list, which could be related to something related to payroll taxes or something. I do see a question in chat versus a contractor's license. The difference between a contractor's license and a general contractor license. So I think what you're talking about is the difference between a general contractor and a subcontractor. Is that correct, Eric?
Kind of. For example, you know, if I'm a flooring company and I want to, you know, do business, but I'm not a general contractor, are those considered a subcontractor for a general contractor license, or can we directly use them for just that flooring project? Or
we can use them as long as they have a contractor's license for flooring. So the only time that a general contractor and a sub comes into play would be if there's like a larger renovation process, and let's say that, you know, contractor A is the general contractor and they have a I think it's a classification A or B license, which allows them to sub out all of the other work. It's up to them to determine that all of the subs that they're subbing out to have the appropriate licenses. But if we're, you know, trying to get work that is just for electrical or just for flooring, that doesn't need to go through like a bigger general contractor. That's really only done on really large construction projects. We can contract with that individual as long as they have the appropriate license for the work they're doing. So,
thank you.
yes. So again, if it's a painting company, that they have the painting license. And like, let me go ahead and I'll show you an example of that as well. So for instance, let me see, because I think I'm going to have to.
I guess one question real quick is, when, Sarah, does it flip over to a general contractor? Like, say, for example, a small vendor company does painting, flooring, and blinds. They do have the appropriate licenses to do those. Do they, if they're combining those services, does that mean they have to have a general contractor license?
No, because there can be companies that have multiple licenses.
Okay.
So a good example, let me think of one that has so like this company, for instance, has 2 different licenses. This would be what's considered kind of like that general contractor license where they would sub out, you know, other work that doesn't fall under this other one. But there could be, let me think of another one that might have something bigger. Okay, so, and this isn't the greatest example, but like this one shows that they have their, sorry, that's the revoked one, C2 electrical, and that it's active. So anything that's underneath that contractor's license, they can do. If it was for painting, for instance, this company has multiple active licenses that are related to the different types of work that they do. So they have one that's specific to painting. This is a subcategory of this main painting and decorating one. If they have a main license like this where it doesn't have a letter after it, that means that they can do anything that's under that classification. When they have one that has this like subcategory, they're limited to only that subclassification. But then they have all these other additional ones that are related to stucco, waterproofing, so on and so forth. As long as they have the license, we can contract with them. Now, if this same company tried to provide you guys a quote for electrical, wouldn't be able to do that. If it was something that was related to refrigeration, you know, AC, if they don't have that appropriate contractor's license, they wouldn't be able to do that. So like a good example would be, yeah. So for instance, this company has refrigeration and air conditioning, as well as plumbing and heating. solar contracting, and steel reinforcing. So they have all these different separate contractors license that they can quote the appropriate work under each one of these. But if they were trying to quote you again for like electrical, they don't hold an electrical contractor's license, therefore they wouldn't be able to do it. Now, if they noted on their quote that work was going to be done by others, like, so for instance, if we had to solicit a quote specifically for that piece of the scope of work, or if they were going to like sub that out, that would need to be noted on there that it was excluded and that they were not performing it themselves. Does that answer that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let me go back into presentation. I want to make sure I'm in the right spot. Okay. Can you guys see my slides again?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. We went over the bidders list. Now for architects and engineers, they have their own professional licenses as well that we also have to verify. Oftentimes this would be the person who signs the quote, who provides the quote. They may have like a PE designation after their name on the signature, which notes they're a professional engineer, or might have AIA, which notes an architectural license. And these are the links to the different websites that we verify that those are still current. Again, these are required for any of those services, regardless of the dollar amount, and needs to be on file with us prior to work commencing. So we need to verify those licenses are active. Now for contracts, I'm going to defer this section to Mel to review in terms of the different types of contracts and routing.
Thank you. And I know we're getting close to time. I just want to be respectful of that. If anyone needs to jump off, we can certainly make sure you get the recorded version to hear the end if you can't stay on longer. But we start off with goods and services that are non-construction and non-professional. At $25,000 to $49,999, we require 2 competitive quotes or an approved competitive exception. For professional services, again, still non-construction, you would need 2 quotes at $25,000 and a formal solicitation or approved competitive exception at $74,999 and above. It's actually $75,000. And then for construction related and or A&E contracts, 3 comparable quotes evaluations between $25,000 and $99,999. Note that competitive exceptions never apply to construction. So the only exception allowed for construction related procurements are the emergency situations that Sarah went over earlier. And then if you're at 100,000 or above and it's construction, we do a formal invitation to bid, or for architects and engineers, a request for qualifications. For contract signing, in the purchasing department, we can sign up to $1 million. That signature delegation has been given to the purchasing department. And this is a recent change and update to policy. Now for contracts that are over 1 million, but less than 3 million, they're signed by the president's office. And then over that $3 million threshold, or over a 5-year term, it needs to be signed by the chancellor. And so those are routed through UNR to the chancellor's office. And then there's also revenue generating contracts. These would be contracts where UNR is going to be receiving payment relative to the contract, or also if it is a no dollar contract, those are signed by Kara Griffin in Business and Finance, and those are routed through Elena Lopez, and she is the fiscal officer for Business and Finance. So keep in mind anything that's no dollar, it would go through her as well. Invitation to bid for goods are always awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. And then for services or revenue, we do requests for proposals, and that's awarded by evaluation criteria that's established in advance of the solicitation and has a committee. And same for requests for qualifications for architects and engineers. And then different types of competitive exceptions that are approved are sole sources, when there's truly only one source to get the services or goods that we need, or if something's proprietary and therefore only we can get it through the manufacturer, or a cooperative agreement where there's already an existing contract that we can leverage because we're an educational institution or a state entity. There are various different cooperative agreements that we use on a regular basis. And those are all listed on our BCN purchasing website.
Thank you, Mel. And then the next slide.
And then this is just a little flow chart to give you an idea of the process. So it starts out with the requisition, it gets routed for approval, and then once it gets to purchasing, that's after the department has approved it. Then purchasing reviews the requisition to make sure it's complete, the right spend category has been used, etc. Then if there's a related contract, we would route that contract to UNR legal counsel to review. And then for contracts over $1 million, they would route to the president to be approved. Or if they need to go to the chancellor's office, they still go to UNR legal, and the UNR president reviews and recommends that contract for approval, and then UNR legal routes it to NSHE and the chancellor's office. And then once the chancellor has signed those contracts, they get routed back to UNR legal, and then we route them to the supplier and copy the department.
Okay, and then the purchase order process. Mel, is this something you'd like to go over?
Sure. This is kind of a roadmap to let you know what happens in advance of the purchase order being issued, and that once the purchase order is issued, that's your green light that you can move forward and have services begin with a supplier, or you can expect that they are going to send you the goods that you're requesting. So it starts out with getting a quote for what you need, or multiple quotes depending upon the dollar threshold, and then gather all the information we went over that you would need to enter a requisition, ensure the supplier registers with the Nevada System of Higher Education. Then once that requisition is initiated in Workday, it'll go through your department and manager approvals, gets to the buyer and purchasing, and then once they've reviewed and everything is in order, we issue a purchase order to the supplier. At that point, you would track the purchase order, and you can do that in Workday, obviously. And then once you've received your goods or services, you would create a receipt in Workday, and then you can route the invoice to accounts payable. And then one thing that gets forgot a lot of times is to let us know to close the PO if we didn't expend all the funds on that PO. So if there's any dollars left on it, it would not automatically close, because we in purchasing would not necessarily know that you've paid all of the invoices relative to that PO. So if you just let us know when we close it, it then liquidates any remaining funds that are on that purchase order, so you can use those funds for another purpose. And then here are the ways that you can track your purchase order. First of all, a notification is sent to the requisition requester, but note that you'll get the notification before the purchase order is issued. It's issued in an overnight process that's automated. So when you see that notification in Workday, you would not be able to create a receipt right then and there, because that PO is only approved and not issued. It would be issued it happens at night, so the next workday. Note also that if a PO was processed for a requester who's since left UNR, we can change that requisition requester to someone else if needed. We just need to be made aware that that person has left and you want them switched over to someone else. You can also track your purchases in the purchases application. And then if you like, you can favorite the purchase order once it's issued, so that you can just automatically go to your favorites in Workday and find it. And then there are a few reports we've offered here. Find purchase order line details. Any of you should be able to run that report. And then the open purchase order lines report can be run by cost center managers. And then a tip, add these reports to your favorites as well, and then you'll always know where to find them. To check and see if your purchase order has been paid, you would go to the purchase order and then go to the related actions of the PO. view the purchase order, and you'll see this screenshot here showing the status and the receiving status. So this example we're using, it's been partially paid and partially received. You can always click on the balances tab, which is at the bottom of the purchase order. And then if you look at the business document line section, that's where the supplier invoices live, and you can navigate to any related supplier invoice. And on the payments tab, you can see what payments have been made, and you can also access an EFT reference or a check number, depending upon how that supplier has opted to be paid. So sometimes a supplier will inquire about payment, but they need, for some reason, for us to give them a reference number so that they can look it up, and that's where you would find that. And then there's another report that cost center managers can run called the uninvoiced purchase orders report, and that will show any PO that still has outstanding balances on it. And in case any of you are not familiar with how to create receipts, we can go over that process as well. And note that we do have an article in the knowledge base that goes through this step by step. So you need to create a receipt in Workday when you want to acknowledge that you've received goods or you have had services completed by the supplier. This can be done by either the requisition requester or anyone who holds the financial administrative assistant role for the related cost center. So the process is to go to the purchase order, go to related actions, go to receipt, and create receipt. Now, a common misconception is that creating a receipt notifies accounts payable that there's something that needs to be paid, and that's actually not the case. Unfortunately, initiating a receipt in Workday does not automate anything to accounts payable. They don't even know you've created a receipt unless you tell them. So you do want to send any invoices that you receive to accounts payable at unr.edu, or we tell the supplier to send the invoice to accounts payable on the PO, but they don't always follow that rule. So if it gets sent to you at the department, you need to forward it on to accounts payable. So a couple of troubleshooting tips that people encounter often is if you try to create a receipt and the PO won't let you do that, it's very possible either one's already created or there's a draft receipt. If there's a draft receipt, Workday won't let you create a new one until that draft has been canceled, or you can edit that draft and process it instead. Also, you can't receive more than is already established on the PO. So if something has changed between the time the purchase order was issued and you go to create the receipt, you may need to reach out to the buyer and ask them to initiate a change order so that it matches what you're actually receiving.
All right. And with that, thank you so much, Mel, for going over those sections.
You bet.
We have the resources section. So I do want to thank you all for your time that we ran over just a little bit longer than anticipated. So I really do appreciate the majority of you staying on. This list of resources has links to our website, the knowledge base, some specific articles that we've gone over, the ICs and guest speakers process, previously recorded training sessions. We will be putting, let's see, or actually already is, the IC and guest speaker training session that we did recently will be posted on there as well. Links to SREG and SREG Lite, Workday Tools, and then how FAAs can get the UNR Bridge procurement certificate. We also have our main BCN purchasing contact email if there's ever a question you want to reach out to us ahead of time, as well as a link to the spend category assignments by buyer that we went over. So at this point, if there are any questions that haven't been asked already, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to everybody. But again, I do really thank you for your participation and attendance to today's training. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you again very much. And if there was anybody that missed this training that does want a copy of the recording, we will share that as well. Or we can also share a copy of the PowerPoint to your department. But thank you very much, and we appreciate your time.